All right, folks. Today's the day. We're going to start out by wrapping up chapter 6, and then we're going to talk about the exams. I apologize. I know everybody wants to see the exams now, but it's been my experience that if I hand the exams back first and talk about those, nothing I say after that will matter. Everybody will be so focused on the exams that they won't pay attention. And this is kind of important stuff because we're wrapping up internal controls, and we need to talk about that. So just as a refresher, what we talked about on Monday, remember that I said that the key to understanding internal controls from an audit perspective is this incredible diagram that I drew using Microsoft Paint. Okay. Which again, if you want to give me extra points on my evaluation, you can say the artwork in this class was superb. Starting with me creating the vouching diagram where I inked in the letters V and pointed an arrow down to this masterpiece right here. This is about the extent of my artwork, which is why I'm an accountant. So just as a reminder, when we talk about controls, the crux of controls are saying we know what a risk is, we implement a control in response to risk, okay? That's what this relationship is right here. But we add a few things in with respect to auditing that are going to be very relevant to what we need to consider. Again, the way we characterize risk from an auditor perspective is we characterize risk using management assertions. So the example I used is we're talking about overstatement of inventory, like inventory, they may commit fraud by overstating inventory. How do we classify that as a management assertion? We said we're concerned about the existence of inventory. That's how we would characterize that. Additionally, once we identify the control, we have to understand, does the control work? Does this control designed properly and is it operating effectively? So we're going to test the control. So it goes beyond what we just learned about routine controls. Not saying controls are not important, but we've got a lot more that we have to consider within context of here. Now, this diagram is kind of a simplification for understanding the flow of information as it goes to an audit with respect to test of controls, and I think it's really important. Once we get to chapters 10 and beyond, we do chapters 10 through 16, which are going to be our business process areas. One of the most important things I'm going to tell you is you have to make sure that everything in this diagram aligns, that your risk and your management assertion are consistent with one another, that your control is an appropriate response to the risk identified, and that we as auditors are appropriately testing the controls. So we'll see some examples of that, and what we're going to see is that it's not always easy to identify whether or not a control is appropriate to a particular assertion or whether an auditor test is appropriate test of that particular control. It takes a little bit of experience with an exposure to that, but we got that coming up. As far as what we're going to talk about at a conceptual level today, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the basics of controls, and we're going to talk about some testing protocols. So with respect to assessing control risk, we talked about the process of evaluating entities' internal control and preventing, detecting, correcting material misstatements in the financial statements. Again, a reminder, we generally categorize controls in one of those two areas, either preventive or detective and corrective. When we say detective and corrective, those can be two categories of controls, but they generally work jointly with one another. It's very rare that you have a detective control without a corrective control or a corrective control without a detective control. They do operate together. When the auditor plans to follow a reliance strategy, that's a strategy where we say we're going to rely on the client's internal controls to provide some of the assurance in the audit. In other words, we would like to set our control risk at something below the highest level. In order to do that, the auditor must do the following. Identify specific controls that we're going to be relied upon. Generally speaking, those are going to be the controls that are most relevant to the assertions that we're testing in a particular control area. Remember, I just talked about inventory and I said existence was a key concern with respect to inventory. We would be concerned about controls that relate to the existence of inventory. That would be our first step. Second step, we are going to perform tests of the identified controls. We're going to understand what the specific tests that we can perform are. And then finally, we're going to conclude on the achieved level of control risk. The achieved level of control risk, again, is what our final assessment is of the controls operating effectiveness and design as to whether or not they're doing well, they're not doing well, the controls are operating effectively, so on and so forth. The good news is that even though we don't have much experience in that yet, we are going to gain some experience through our homework assignment on Wednesday. You all are actually going to test controls, and it's going to be in the purchasing process that you remember back from AIS. It's going to be a little bit foreign, a little bit chaotic, but trust me when I say it is not difficult to understand. Once we walk through the process and see how the process works, it'll be very, very intuitive as to what we're looking at here. So we're going to see the alignment of everything within that control sequence that we talked about. As far as what types of controls we're testing, remember we talked about this before the exam. I said we talked about what we can do as hard to test the controls. We said there are basically 5 types of test work. We said inspection of records and documents, inquiry, observation, and reperformance. There was a fifth one that I threw in there that I said that was an additional one that's not on our list. Does anybody remember what that was called? It's a combination of all four of these effectively. Heard walkthrough, yeah, walkthrough, very good. Walkthrough. So we've got the four listed up here, and then I wanted to define walkthrough because walkthrough is basically a combination of all these. But we talked of types of test controls. There are four that we listed here, and these are defined by accounting standards. Here's some examples of how we would use these within a process area. So I'm just going to walk through one, but we talk about inquiry of appropriate entity personnel. So if we're talking about looking at accounts receivable, we could talk to the credit manager about the policies for writing off uncollectible accounts. That would be an example of an inquiry step we were doing. Now, I want to define walkthrough here because I told you before the first exam, all you need to know about walkthrough is it's a test of control, and it's a combination of all these steps. And that's actually defined by accounting standards. The accounting standards say walkthrough is a combination of these. But more specifically, a walkthrough is where we follow a transaction through a client's financial system from inception to inclusion to the financial statements from beginning to end. So we look at a transaction as it enters the client's system, as it enters the client's financial framework, and we look at it from the point that it starts to the point that it hits the financial statements. And we can think about that in a process area because you're all familiar with the process areas. We discussed them in AIS. Think about what happens in a revenue process. So a customer sends a sales order. So that would be the inception of a transaction. There's an approval function, and it goes through the approval step, and then there's a delivery of the merchandise, and then the merchandise, once the merchandise is delivered, there's a generation of an invoice. Then the customer sends a payment, and the payment gets recorded, and all of that goes into this system. Okay, we recognize the sales transaction and the payment transaction. A walkthrough would take that transaction, an individual transaction, and go through every single step of the client's information system to make sure that it hits the necessary points, identifying the controls that are in place along the way. So that's effectively all a walkthrough is. It is what it sounds like. It's walking through the transaction. All right. So just as a reiteration, after plans, tests, and controls are completed, the auditor should reach a conclusion on the achieved level of control risk. What do we use this achieved level of control risk? To determine the level of detection risk that is needed to bring the audit risk to an acceptably low level. So just as a redefinition of detection risk, we've kind of talked about it and say detection risk is the auditor's tolerance for risk. Basically, remember, we're trying to fill that assurance bucket or fill that assurance Chipotle burrito, whichever you prefer, trying to get it to the highest level. If control risk is really high, we may need to do more work during substantive testing to get the remaining assurance. That's what we're trying to dictate here. So it all is a sequential step, okay? How much assurance do we get at the first phase, the second phase, the third phase? How much do we need to complete the process? The level of detection risk is used to determine the nature, time, and extent of substantive test. Again, this is intuitive, as we talked about. Detection risk low means the work that we have to do is high. Detection risk high, the work that we have to do to wrap up is low. Now, we like high detection risk, even though it sounds like it's not something we should like. Again, it's our tolerance and our appetite for risk. So that's kind of the testing of controls in a nutshell. Now we're going to get into a little bit more specific detail about controls testing and its mechanisms as it relates to reporting in the next chapter. So we've got another whole chapter on controls because, again, I like controls so much that I'm not going to do just 1 week. We're doing 2 whole weeks of controls, plus a whole bunch of other stuff in processes. But at the basic level, we understand controls, and we understand the controls relate to assertions, and we need to test those controls as they relate to assertions. That is something we're going to talk about on Friday when we go through the homework about how do we do this process. And believe it or not, it's not particularly that difficult. Control testing is effectively just a yes or no question. We answer a question, is the control working or is it not? If the answer is a control is effective, we say control is effective. If not, the control is not effective. We're going to actually expand upon this a little bit more when we talk about sampling right before break, but sampling will also be included in this. We'll talk about how that relates to controls as well. But one thing I want to wrap up with is if you've ever done an audit internship, you've probably heard the terminology that sometimes work is performed at interim versus sometimes you're at a year end. Usually when most of our students take internships, they take internships during the summer, which is never during the busy season, so it's usually slow. You usually get to go to like fancy restaurants and you get to go hang out and you work less than 40 hours a week and you're just kind of like, oh, this is great. For those of you who are daring enough to take a spring internship, you're just kind of like absolute mad chaos. So spring internship usually is what we categorize as a year-end internship. So the very few times we had students take a internship during the fall, we usually call that interim. But what do those terms actually mean? and we need to characterize that and what they represent with respect to audits. The reason this is part of this chapter is that interim testing is highly relevant to how we view and categorize controls within a client structure. So let's go ahead and talk about this term interim. And I say this first statement, audit procedures may be conducted at an interim date or at year end, period end. So basically we can perform test work either before the year is actually completed, or we can do it after the year is completed and we have all the results of our testing, all right, our analysis. So you can kind of see the example of this year. This is the client's calendar year, and this is year 2021, I guess would be the year here. We start at the beginning of the year. The auditor kind of starts out halfway through the year, and they say they want to gain an understanding about things and start planning the audit. Then they're going to do some interim test of controls, which we're going to talk a little bit about in detail. And then we're going to conduct some substantive tests. And then the year ends. This is the financial statement date year end, 12/31/21. This is when the audit finalizes. This would be considered to be the year end period. We're still conducting substantive tests. We'll also conduct some test of controls here, which we'll talk about here. But about a month and a half later, the auditor issues their audit report. So this timeline is effectively talking about the idea that we conduct some testing before the audit period even ends. And a lot of that's going to be test of controls. Some of it can include substantive testing. Now, what is the relationship here? Let's think about this just to kind of the context of this particular course. How many exams do I give in this course? So I have 3 midterm exams and then 1 final exam. Now, let's just go ahead and let's suspend reality and say that I'm going to give 1 exam. Which would be the most effective means for me to give 1 exam? To wait until to do it at interim or to do it at year end? Well, there's advantages to both, okay? The advantage to do a midterm exam is that get it out of the way early, and everybody be like, Dr. Barnes, if you did a year-end exam, I'm way too busy during finals week, and that would give me nightmares. I say, if I wait till the semester end, you like want to do interim, okay? All right. So that's certainly an argument for an interim test, okay? Now the argument for a semester end test, I said year end, but a semester end test is that we have gone over everything in this course that you need to know. So I would be effectively testing all knowledge that you've gained in this course. So we can argue that's effective, but you are also going to be very, very unhappy. Those evaluations that I keep making jokes about would be kind of like 0, 0, 0, 0. It's like, I hate Dr. Barnes, can't believe he did 1 exam, you know. Obviously, you all are very, very busy as Truman students, okay? So you would like to have something other than just that 1 exam that tests all of your knowledge, like that 500-point exam that's going to be your entire grade. That would be misery incarnate. Same holds true for an audit, okay? The same holds true for an audit. The auditor is going to be busy during year end. They're going to be very busy. So they probably do not want to have all of their work stuffed into year end in this period right here, which is why they spread it out. Now, there are some definite advantages in that because of this, the auditor completes some of that testing during year end, like you complete some of your tests, some of the exams in the course before the semester end. The disadvantage is that interim testing is typically less effective than year-end or period-end testing. So I said if I gave you 1 exam, if I gave you an interim exam, let's say that I gave you an exam right before spring break, and I said this is the only exam in the course. Would that effectively test your knowledge of the entire course? No, because we've only gone through half the content in the course, all right? So one of 2 things would happen. Either I would just have to test you on everything up to that point, which everybody would still be miserable. It's like, we haven't covered this content yet. It's not fair, Dr. Barnes. Or I'd cover the content up until that point, and I'd give you the exam, and I say, all right, we don't have any more exams, but I'm still going to teach you after this, all right? What do you think the classroom would look like after that? It'd be kind of like, well, if he's not testing, I'll see you, you know, I'm just not going to be here. So regardless, that would not be an effective use of time. So the solution that I come up with, obviously, and that every professor, most professors come up with, is we have a combination of interim and year-end testing, or interim and semester testing, which is the same thing that auditors do. So we want to actually give you the easier tests, the easier test when you're not so busy during the interim, and then you've got that final test to wrap up everything. Okay, that's kind of the idea behind that. So the pros. Assertion may not be tested at significance. So auditor may test controls at interim date because the assertion tested may not be significant. So we're talking specifically about controls testing interim date. I apologize. The control has been effective in prior audits, or maybe more efficient to conduct tests at time. All right. So the first one is basically saying, look, it's not a big deal if we test the controls at interim date. We don't need it to be completely and totally reliable, simply because the assertion is not that significant. We're talking about rights and obligation. Actually, it wouldn't be a controls test. We're talking about classification in an area where classification is not traditionally concerned. So we can test this control. It'll be very easy. Or we look at prior periods and prior audits. This control has always been effective. So if we test it during a period and we find it effective again, we've got a lot of assurance it's going to continue to be effective. This last one's kind of interesting. Maybe more efficient to conduct the test at that time. Is it likely that if I test a control at, say, mid-year, that the control will continue to operate in the same way over time? So say, for example, I've got a control that says, all right, access to the warehouse is limited to personnel who have a key card. That's a control that's controls that covers custody, okay? If I check that and I say, okay, nobody who entered the warehouse, everybody who entered the warehouse swiped their key card, and these are all key people who are supposed to be authorized to have key cards, I am happy this control is operating effectively. And I test that at June. And then I come back in December. Should I assume that that control is probably operating the exact same way as when I did it during June? Probably so. Probably so. I'd get that assignment. I'm not going to say I'm going to take it at face value. I'm not going to just say the control is still working, but I'm going to assume the control is probably operating the same way. The control is not going to change over time. All right. So that's why we can actually test controls at interim date, because we assume the controls are going to be effective in certain ways. Also, conducting interim test of controls, staff accounts may be less busy during interim. We know that that's the case because year end is generally chaos. Testing controls at interim date can give the auditor time to reassess controls, can modify the audit plan if controls are found to be deficient. So this is kind of an interesting one. We've talked about the nature of audit risk being sequential, and the control risk dictates detection risk. If I really want to know how much substantive testing I'm going to do during year end, it's probably good for me to get the controls testing out of the way early, so I can make a good assessment of what detection risk should actually be. Then finally, interim testing enables management to correct any identified misstatements or remediate any control deficiencies prior to year end. So we do test the controls, we find controls not working, and we tell management, look, your controls are not good. This could be problematic if we come to year end and they're still not working that way. This gives our clients, the managers of our client, a chance to fix the problems and say, you're right, we know that we've got problems during the year, but we can fix these problems and make them be acceptable by year end. It won't fix the problems that occurred during the year, but at least we would have knowledge the control is operating effectively as of year end. So what are some cons? Well, contesting controls at interim date may increase the risk of material misstatement and control deficiencies are present. So if we test during testing only an interim date and things change, then what happens? Our assumptions that controls are operating effectively are no longer viable. So how can an auditor control for this potential problem? We can consider when it's appropriate to examine an account at an interim date and perform selective procedures for the period between interim date and year end. So when we talked about tested interim dates, we do want to make sure that we understand when the controls are operating a certain way, we want to make sure those controls are operating the same way at period end. Usually what this will require is auditor doing some follow-up work to make sure the controls are still operating effectively. We can also extend this to substantive testing. We haven't really talked too much about that, but is it possible that some of our substantive testing could take place at an interim period as well? Certainly. We don't have to save all of our substantive testing for year end. If we can get some of it out of the way early, that'd be great. It'd be great if I said, okay, we can get some of the assignments done before the end of the semester. Like, let's finish up this big project halfway through the semester. That way we don't have to worry about it anymore. It stresses you out when you're working on it, but at the end of the semester, you're like, I'm sure glad I don't have that big project on my hanging over my head. That's something that you all can relate to very closely, and an auditor can relate to as well. Getting this work done out early can be important. That being said, if we're talking about substantive procedures, oftentimes we're looking at certain accounts and we're trying to make sure the account balance is correct as of the year-end date. Does everybody see a problem with that? If I'm trying to determine if an account is stated correctly as of year-end, and I'm testing the account before year-end, I probably don't have all the information I need. So I can test some of that before year-end, but I still need to do some follow-up work at year-end to account for that. One thing that we used to do, and back in when I worked in audit, we do interim testing. We would do confirmations, accounts receivable confirmations, and we'd send some of the confirmations before period end and then some of the confirmations after period end to account for that discrepancy. So that might be an example of something that you would do in that regard. All right. Something we talked about in AIS, we talked about service organizations, and these are becoming increasingly more prominent within the scope of auditing, with the scope of organizations in general. Now, service organization controls reports are massive. There's a lot of different categories. We're going to focus on one category of reports. That being said, there is one of the possible presentation topics at the end of the semester, which is service organization control reports. That's an interesting area because it's becoming more and more pronounced over time. So let's talk very generally about SOC reports. And so I think I said service organization control reports. It's technically what they used to be called, but they're actually now called system and organization controls reports. So a SOC report technically stands for system and organization control reports, but they still relate to service organization operations. So the way that we used to view this is we used to view this as checking to make sure we understand how services that are not part of organization affect the control system of organization. An example of this that was commonly used tend to be outsourced services like payroll. So has anybody ever heard of ADP? They're an outsourced payroll provider service that basically says, we'll do your payroll for you so you don't have to hire people to do that, which is great. It's actually very beneficial in that regard because you can outsource something and not necessarily have to worry about it with your own organization. But it creates problems because that means that their security is now your security, or your security is now their security. So the names in the personnel, social security numbers, personal data, you are sharing that with a third party, and they are responsible for security of that information. Does that make anybody a little bit antsy with all the talk about data breaches that existed over time? Certainly, I would be a little bit concerned about that too. So we as auditors try to make sure that if we have that situation exist where a third party that provides services for our client, that we can actually understand the nature of controls in that third party. This is the nature of service organization reports, or SOC reports. So an organization provides accounting services to an entity. Those services are considered part of the client entity's financial reporting system. Now, it says accounting services. I would say we could talk about this in much more general, broad terms. Anything that affects the accounting information system. It doesn't even need to be accounting services. One example would be a internet service provider. I would argue that an internet service provider is a fundamental part of an accountant or of an entity's organizational system, organizational infrastructure. They affect the information system. They affect the accounting protocols, the communication of information within the system. So it could be something even as broad as that. So one of the auditor's concerns is the internal control system in place at the service organization. And what we're going to do is, depending on how important or how prominent that particular service provider is in place, we are going to obtain an understanding of the entity's internal control by making sure that we actually include a report on the service organization's controls. And this is called that System and Organization Control Report, a SOC report. Now, like I said, there is a lot of different categories of SOC reports. We're going to focus on one category of SOC reports, and I'm going to tell you it's very simple to remember which one we're focusing on, because it's one category of reports and it's SOC 1, okay? SOC 1 is what we're concerned about as auditors. Now, you probably ask, is there a SOC 2 and a SOC 3, Dr. Barnes? And you're probably just, kind of SOC 1, SOC 2. Yeah, there actually are SOC 1 and SOC 2 and SOC 3 reports. And then there's a SOC 4 and SOC 5, except they're not called SOC 4 and SOC 5. They're called something else. But yeah, we're concerned about a SOC 1 report. And a SOC 1 report, System and Organization Control Report, is basically reporting on internal controls over financial reporting at a service organization. That is what its focus is. Now, I do want you to remember something else about this. This is the most important part that I'm going to talk about. So for a SOC 1 report, there are two different types of reports that an auditor can request. The first of these is called a SOC 1 Type 1. SOC 1 Type 1. And a SOC 1 Type 1 report basically says, we would like to know about the design of the controls in place at the service organization. Service organization. The design of controls in place at a point in time. So those are two important particular notes. Type 1 focuses on the design of controls in place at the service organization at a point in time. So if that is one type of report, does anyone want to guess what the other type of report is? The first type is SOC 1 Type 1. Second one is SOC 1 Type 2. Yes, good guess, good guess. You're an expert. Yeah, SOC 1 Type 2. SOC 1 Type 2 actually requests information about the design and operating effectiveness of controls in place at a service organization over a period of time. So the design and operating effectiveness controls in place at a service organization over a period of time. So I know you're thinking to yourself, those sound very similar, Dr. Barnes, and they are, but there's some important distinctions. Again, SOC 1 Type 1 basically says I only care about design, and I'm only looking at a single point in time. SOC 1 Type 2 says I'm concerned both about the design of the controls and the operating effectiveness of controls. And when I understand those over a period of time, I want to know about those over a period of time. So SOC 1 Type 2, design, operating effectiveness over a period of time. By the way, just based on my descriptions right there, if you were really, really concerned about a particular organization, you say, I want the highest quality of SOC report I can possibly get as an auditor, would you request a SOC 1 Type 1 or SOC 1 Type 2? Type 2 definitely provides more information and more detail. SOC 1 Type 1 is when we generally do not need a lot of assurance. It's an area that does not require a lot of controls assurance. Okay. But both are valid. And I will say SOC 1 Type 2 is definitely more expensive than a SOC 1 Type 1. So that's something to consider yourselves as well. All right. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at what we're going to be looking at moving forward into Chapter 7. So under SOX, management of public companies must prepare an assessment of internal control effectiveness, and the registered auditor must issue an opinion of effectiveness of internal controls. Now, I want to make a note of this, okay? This specifically refers to internal controls over financial reporting. So remember earlier, like Monday, we were talking about this, I said there were 3 objectives. There's reporting, operations, and compliance. And I said the most important one is reporting for our purposes. This slide is specifically referring to controls that relate to reporting, which is going to be our focus for Chapter 7. We are going to need to understand a few things. Management of these organizations, they have to issue a report saying, here's what we've done with respect to controls over financial reporting, and we believe that these controls are operating effectively. We as auditors have a responsibility to test those controls for public companies. Additionally, we have to issue a whole separate report just on the controls. So we've talked about audit reports. Audit reports relate to the financial statements. This is an audit report over internal controls, which thankfully we're not going to look at and we're not going to try to learn about because it's a little bit muddled, but we do need to know a little bit about what it is that we're looking at. In evaluating internal controls over financial reporting, auditors are going to consider 3 key possibilities, okay? Technically 4, but 4 is basically saying nothing's wrong. So there's a possibility nothing's wrong, okay? That's kind of our default scenario. But let's say that they go in and they look at a control and say, this control is not working, but it's not a major problem. This is something we generally classify as a control deficiency. And basically everything that we look at is considered to be a control deficiency until we think that it becomes worse. So anytime we see a problem, we say this is a control deficiency. But let's say that's not a big problem. We say this is just a control deficiency. That's all we need to know. On the other hand, we could go in and we could say, this is a problem. It's not going to probably result in a material misstatement, but left unchecked, it could become a significant problem over time. This is something we can call a significant deficiency. This is basically something it's not likely to result in a material misstatement in the current period, but left unchecked could become problematic over time. The big one is considered to be called as something that would likely result in a material misstatement. And predictably, it's called a material weakness. A material weakness is basically saying the control is so bad that transactions flowing in through here are likely to result in material misstatement. The control is not working properly. Now, we'll get a little bit more distinction on that next week about what all that all represents. It's important to note that we have to evaluate this and we've got to make some determinations based on what we think controls look like as the auditors. That's part of our responsibility over the course of the audit. All right, that does it for Chapter 6. Obviously, we've got some homework for that we're going to be talking about when we get on Friday. Again, the homework should provide a little bit more enlightenment for some of the things that we talked about today, specifically the type of testing we do internal controls, but we'll get more into that on Friday.